Today's video essay is brought to you by Brilliant.org. I am back from the continents, and yes, continents in this case means Europe, and it's been a brilliant 10 days out in the warmth of Paris, and sometimes there was a bit of a heat wave, and I do confess that I do prefer the cold a little bit more than the heat strokes I was getting in Paris. So a lot of things happened during my trip to the continent, including breaking into the front gates of the ENS, which is also known as the École Normale Supérieure, and that's like the home of the granddaddies of French intellectuals like Derrida, Sartre, Simone Weil, and then all the big people basically went there. And here's some video evidence of my philosophical comrade Hannah and I technically breaking into the ENS. So after a huge extended trek, we are here at the prestigious École Normale Supérieure. How do you feel? Do you feel like...
I feel like we found it, but we need to know how to get in. That's the next
Can we even
thing.
get in? There's a door right there with a buzzer. Not everyone could get in. So after some trials and errors, we snuck into the École Normale Supérieure. We didn't want to film in the main courtyard because...
We really snuck in.
Yeah.
We might have been allowed to, but it didn't look like it, so
No.
we just sort of walked in.
We snuck upstairs. This is probably where Sartre and Beauvoir and Simone Weil used to walk around. And that's the main courtyard of the École. But after all that is done, I am back to my bedroom, to my stack of books behind me, and I think it's time to shake things up after a period of reflection. If you watch my normal videos, there's always this sneaky sense that I'm like racing against time. It's kind of like with a 10 to 15 minute time limitation, I always feel like I'm on kind of like a late night show, where before I could even get to the meat of the topic, well, the YouTube video is already trying to cut me off. And as people know, literature, philosophy, and all these very interesting subjects, you don't actually tend to get to the meat until you're like a little bit further into the video. And tonight's subject, without further rambling, is going to be about that time where mathematics and the natural sciences almost killed philosophy off forever. It's very scary if you think about it, because nowadays philosophy is still a subject that's widely taught in high schools and at universities, but there's just a bit of that stuff that's going on at universities which I don't particularly agree with. And after surveying some of the universities in France, I feel like there's really a different, attitude in terms of like how we should approach philosophy. So today's little history seminar is going to cover some of those differences in attitudes between continental philosophy and, well, analytic philosophy, even though some of you guys can debate over this line over and over and over again. Is there such a divide between the analytical tradition and a continental tradition? But nevertheless, story comes first. Story comes over technicality. So without further ado, let us break into this interesting story of how philosophy nearly died on the end of a noose in the 20th century. So let us confront reality for a second, especially like in grad school or when you head over to one of these higher research institutions. And I don't know what that's like just yet, but I have attended a few faculty parties. More often than not, philosophy students are kind of easy to make fun of at these parties. I mean, if you ask a philosophy student, what are you actually studying? What are you actually trying to do with your research? Or if you ask a philosophy professor, why is it important to study philosophy? More often than not, they can't really give you a straight answer. They're so proficient at these acts of word vomiting. And by the time you get to the end of their monologues, you're more confused than ever, and you don't really have your answer. So what is philosophy for? To simplify matters for a little bit, ever since the dawn of time, ever since Socrates like roamed the markets and sort of like challenged people's beliefs and invented his Socratic dialogues, philosophy as a subject mainly fell under three different categories. Metaphysics, which is basically asking the question of why the hell do things exist and how do they work? Epistemology, which is the study of how do we know anything? How the hell do we know anything for certain? And of course, ethics, which is basically the study of how the hell do you know if you're a good person, or how do we become good people? And ever since that guy Socrates walked the earth, and when he was followed by his wrestler disciple Plato, well, they've been trying to answer these questions for like thousands of years, and sometimes you think to yourself, surely they're going to arrive at some definitive answer after thousands of years of inquiry into this kind of stuff. I mean, look at science. You give a prominent scientist like 20 or 30 years of a brilliant career, they can in a sense, upturned the entirety of how human beings understand the world. But what about philosophy? It's been a few thousand years since we've seen anything new that's happening to philosophy. And naturally, people, not just me, not just people around you, not just people who don't understand philosophy, they started to raise some doubts. They started to think that, well, what is all this finger painting that these people are doing? That basically lasted for like a few thousand years, but there still aren't many concrete answers from this field. And just like these confused members of the faculty parties, well, these people started to wonder, is philosophy up to any good? So these people, during the early part of the 20th century, got to work, and they wanted to answer this question once and for all. And one of these people who set out to answer this question was none other than the gentleman named Ludwig Wittgenstein. And the story was Wittgenstein consulted these logicians, and one of them was the 20th century mastermind Bertrand Russell. And when he was studying under Russell, when he was starting his life at Cambridge, when he moved from Vienna to England, there was an account of Wittgenstein getting really mad at philosophers for not really getting to the point after thousands of years. He is reading philosophy up there, but only has just started systematic reading. And he expresses the most naive surprise that all the philosophers he once worshipped in ignorance are after all stupid and dishonest and make disgusting mistakes. So this guy Wittgenstein, gradually, in his own quirky way, started to realize that maybe after thousands of years of doing philosophy, these philosophers were on the wrong track because they relied on one of the things that's not that reliable at all to do philosophy with. And that thing is what I'm currently using to communicate with you right here, right now. That is the thing that gave birth to many great novels. That is the thing that gave rise to many headaches when you're trying to acquire a new form of this thing. And yes, we're talking about language. Wittgenstein basically thought that after thousands of years, these people are not really getting anywhere. And the reason for that is they've placed too much faith in language. They relied on this collection of clunky things called words and grammar and whatever comprises a language, intonations. Basically, it was the wrong tool for the job. I mean, try to describe the taste of something disgusting to a person who has never tasted it. Of course, you can evoke some image in their head, but fundamentally, you can't really use language to describe some experience fully, because chances are the other person's gonna have their own interpretation of whatever you're talking about, and chances are, when you use the same tool to describe such grand things, like what does it mean to be moral, what does it mean to be a good person, what does it mean to exist, what does it mean to be a philosopher? All these very complicated questions, language seems to be such an inadequate tool that Wittgenstein started to call into question. He thought that if we could solve the problem of language, then we can solve the problem of philosophy once and for all. And this was the subject of his 1922 book, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, which was such a tiny book which took him forever to write. And even though, after he's written it, it was virtually an impenetrable piece of work that took logicians, decades to figure out what it was about. The main idea is basically that there are logical structures to how we describe the world around us, or states of affairs. And if there is such a logical structure, then we can communicate things clearly using this new philosophical language. And hence, when we try to reach beyond what language is supposed to do, it simply wouldn't make any sense. They're simply statements that reach beyond the scope of language. And these are statements that Wittgenstein thought that, they basically cannot be talked about. And if you talk about them, they're quickly going to become, babbles of nonsense. And here's the quote that even non-Wittgenstein readers know to some extent. And the quote goes, "What can be said clearly, where if one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." When I first started tackling Wittgenstein, a part of me is like, this person has only published 2 official pieces of work in his lifetime. How significant could he be? How revolutionary of a thinker could he be? But in retrospect, I can kind of see where these scholars are coming from. To upturn thousands of years of philosophical history by decrying them as pure nonsense, in Wittgenstein's case, that's basically confining a big chunk of philosophical history, to the trash bin. Because philosophy for a long time was an attempt of using language and words to build grand systems about how reality works. And it's really not that surprising that after writing this book, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, Wittgenstein seriously thought that he had solved all of the problems in philosophy and just kind of quit philosophy and ran away until he came back years later. But that's later Wittgenstein, and if you want to know more about Wittgenstein, I'll make a dedicated video I say about Wittgenstein. But here, let's get on with this topic of how logic and principles of verification and natural sciences almost killed philosophy over the span of a few years. Now, even in the field of logic today, scholars are still debating this topic of like, what did Wittgenstein mean when he said like, what can be said clearly, and where one cannot speak, there one must be silent. But for some of these thinkers who resided in the 20th century, they basically took that statement to mean that like there are things that we simply cannot talk about, and why don't we just focus on things that we can talk about instead of trying to verify all these nebulous concepts in philosophy? And it just so happened that these bands of people who really took to Wittgenstein's statement, they happened to be very hard-nosed logicians and mathematicians who didn't have a taste for anything vague-sounding. So, with Wittgenstein's partial blessings, a band of people started a bit of a reading group in Vienna that officially started in 1924 called a Vienna Circle, and they basically decided to reinvent philosophy once and for all, based on this criterion of verification, or this criterion of let's just focus on the things that we can verify instead of worrying about all these things that language cannot do or language cannot reach. And the main idea goes something along the lines of this: if there is a logical structure to language, if there are these logical truths in a sentence that we can verify, why don't we just verify the hell out of them without really worrying about anything lofty or anything that's remotely confusing? And a line in this, beautifully written book called Metaphysical Animals, how 4 women brought philosophy back to life, kind of described it really well. These very logical philosophers went from asking what is good to what does good mean? And one of the young men who really took up this idea was the philosopher by the name of A.J. Ayer. And he really took up this idea and basically reduced philosophy from something like this to something that looks something like this. To take things a step further, A.J. Ayer in his work, Language, Truth, and Logic, single-handedly argued that if there's something that cannot be verified either logically or empirically, they simply have to be categorized as a nonsense statement. So theological statements like, does God exist? Or moral statements like, is it bad to steal? Or all these questions that philosophers have been asking for thousands of years were once and for all confined to the trash. And that little book, Language, Truth, and Logic, was surely a bombshell to the entire discipline. From that point, to the dismay of many comrades in the humanities, philosophy became a science, and it's strictly based on principles of verification, and it's strictly based on logical facts and verifiable logical statements. And our buddy and old pal Bertrand Russell even wrote something like this in one of his letters: I believe that a certain sort of mathematician have far more philosophical capacity than most people who take up philosophy. Hitherto, the people attracted to philosophy have been mostly those who loved big generalizations, which were all wrong, so that few people with exact minds have taken up the subject. It has long been one of my dreams to found a great school of mathematically minded philosophers. And for these young philosophers who are also logicians and mathematicians, quote, there's no next, said A.J. Ayer. Philosophy has come to an end. Finished. So this decisive turn in philosophy was very devastating to the entire field, and especially to the field of ethics, because ethics kind of belong to this entire category of truths that cannot really be empirically verified. I mean, what criterion do you have to really logically justify a moral action? Sometimes people just want to be nice. Sometimes people want to put themselves before other people, and based on a strictly logical analysis of certain situations, sometimes a perfectly logical person might actually be a bit of an asshole. And Ayer's early position on ethics was that morality was entirely a subjective sort of business, and he adopted this term called moral subjectivism. And some people in these lecture halls, these angry young men, even adopted this derogatory term called the Buhara theory, that in a sense categorized all moral judgments and all moral opinions under, well, emotional outbursts. It's really saying that whenever you make a moral pronouncement like stealing is wrong or you should not steal a baby's ice cream, you're basically expressing a subjective moral judgment. You're basically letting your emotions loose, and you're like, because you don't like baby's ice creams getting stolen, not because there's some ultimate rule of morality that's preventing you from stealing a baby's ice cream. I mean, intuitively, to like normal-minded people, that just sounds a bit cruel. Why would you steal a baby's ice cream, And why would you logically go through the steps to verify this moral claim? And a picture that the logical positivists painted was kind of grim about the states of affairs of reality, because basically it's advocating for a world with no further mysteries to ponder. Everything is right in front of us in the forms of logical equations and empirically verifiable truths. And at this point of the story, here is where philosophy nearly died, or nearly stopped in its tracks in its duty of contemplating the biggest questions of the universe. However, let it be fate or providence, a decisive turn came around, which changed philosophy yet again and kind of returned philosophy to what it used to be before, back in the good old days. For context, universities during the early 1920s or the late 1920s, before the Second World War really kicked off, the student body was mainly comprised of, very jittery young men. And these young men were dying to distinguish themselves. These young men were basically, dying to be the smartest in the room. And this new template of being able to destroy people with facts and logic and empirical verifications was very alluring to these young men. So many of these young men went around these school halls terrorizing people with, nonsense or boo-hurrah. But towards the end of the 1930s, a very decisive event in history kicked into gears. And this event was such a tragic event. And it's one of these events that scholars would never ever stop writing about. And you guessed it, it is the Second World War. And guess what happened to all these aggressive young men? They got conscripted to war. So for a few months to a year, lecture halls that used to be packed full of aggressive young intellectuals were filled with women philosophers and refugee philosophers from the continents, also known as European philosophers. And with this very interesting combination, philosophy, then again, experienced a renaissance and experienced a new direction in terms of its purpose and its destiny. So essentially, after these young men went to war, Oxford University was a melting pot full of interesting ideas and melting pot full of older professors who still kind of believed in the importance of metaphysics. And before the war really kicked off, analytical philosophy was all the craze. Everyone was after it. But right now, with this collection of women philosophers and old philosophers and refugee philosophers, there was a new blend of thinking going on below the surface. So there's a bit of a restoration of the old values of philosophy, which is like contemplating what it means to be a good person, and basically all the big questions returned to the lecture halls of Oxford. And at this point, 4 women philosophers, Mary Midgley, Philippa Foot, Iris Murdoch, and Elizabeth Enscombe, all set out to rescue moral philosophy from the bin. And if you do a broad survey of the works of these 4 amazing women moral philosophers, you'd realize that, it's pretty unconventional at the time to raise the problems of morality again. But at the same time, it is no accident that they were philosophizing about what it means to be moral, because there was literally a devastating war that's happening across the channel. The early fantasies of reducing philosophy down to some verifiable truth, or reducing philosophy down to something that can be empirically observed, they all kind of flew out of the window. And the real urgent cause here is to figure out, how do we act as moral agents in times of crises? And these women kind of banded together with the older academics at the university, also known as the old men philosophers, and some of these refugee philosophers from Europe wanted to repair the damage A.J. Ayer had done to philosophy. One of these old man philosophers, Donald McKinnon, wrote, "Ayer's manifesto extracts from that source of logical verification a vision of humans as efficient calculating machines. Under the threat of the newly weaponized 'I don't understand' and nonsense, the human animal is subordinated to science and forced to renounce not just his morality, but his co-natural curiosity, his very essence." To these Oxford philosophers at the time, as a sweeping generalization, philosophy shouldn't really be about finding precise answers, but it's all about continuously battling impossible questions that one day we might never answer. But the process of doing philosophy is actually where the fruit is going to bear, because the journey of contemplating, that's what's going to reform you as a person. The journey of digging through difficult texts, that's what's going to train you as a critical thinker. And of course, as human beings, we all have deep curiosity and moral strivings that simply cannot be replicated by machines. And deep down, in a sense, we're all metaphysical animals. So that concludes our little voyage into philosophical history and into how philosophy almost died during the 20th century and how these people kind of revived it and it's a very interesting story. And if you want to look a little deeper into this, I do recommend Metaphysical Animals. This is a kind of a short book. It looks large, but trust me, it's a pretty short book to read. And speaking of mathematics and logic and all the stuff that we've been talking about in this video, today's episode is brought to you by Brilliant.org, the simplest, easiest, and perhaps one of the most interesting ways to learn the things that you used to hate in high school. So personally, I am no stranger to analytical philosophy, and in fact, a few semesters ago, I had to take a subject called the philosophy of language, and the professors basically blasted us with a crash course in mathematical logic and all the stuff that you need to learn to really understand Bertrand Russell's paper on denoting. But I didn't have at the time that I wished I had was an app like Brilliant.org that could really explain all the ins and outs of these very complicated subjects in a very easy to access way and in a fun way. And this is what Brilliant.org really is. It's the best way to learn math, data science, and computer science interactively. New topics ranging from machine learning to AI to set theory, all these really nerdy things that you think you'd never understand are released gradually as lessons every month to Brilliant.org. And you can really customize these lessons to your own skill level and needs. So in order for myself to really understand what logic is all about, recently I started taking the course in formal logic on Brilliant.org because, well, I'm diving into kind of like more Wittgenstein when I'm heading back to university. So for me, it's just a very natural and gentle way for me to become familiar with the concepts of formal logic and notations and all these things that weren't taught in high school. Puzzles on this app really train my mind to think about reality in a different way, and that's what really mathematics can do to your brain. It trains you to think about reality in a very different way, just like philosophy, and don't reject it just because you hated it in high school. And as a lucky viewer of the channel, you can get started for free for 30 days at Brilliant.org and get 20% off of an annual plan by visiting Brilliant.org/RCWalden. And I'm very interested to hear what kind of lessons you've gleaned from Brilliant.org and how your new knowledge in mathematics is informing other subjects you're studying. And again, thank you Brilliant.org for sponsoring today's video, and that is the end of today's history lesson. RC Waldun here. Thank you for watching today's video, and take care and goodbye.